I think what we'll do is we'll talk, each of us, a little bit about, whatever our opening comments are. And I don't have a child with autism, but every child with autism is my child. And I'll tell you why. And every child with autism is your child. And I'll tell you why. Louis Conti brought up the social aspect, the social responsibility that our society owes to children who suffered vaccine injury. And if vaccines are of use to anyone, and if families are asked to put their children at risk of harm, doesn't that make them the heroes of our society? Doesn't that mean that they actually took one for the team and they should be celebrated as heroes? Okay, so there's obviously something else going on here. I innocently walked into the blender of autism science when I decided to write a book. The book was Cures versus Profits, to ask the question, how can we bring better medicine to market in spite of the profit motive? It's a great question. I wrote 16 chapters and decided at the last minute, what's the number one successful thing that has ever come to market? Oh, I know, vaccines. They're great. Save millions of lives. They're safe and effective. So I tried to write a chapter on vaccines. And the chapter reads like this: vaccines are safe, vaccines are effective, they save millions of lives, Andrew Wakefield. I said, whatever happened to that guy? I heard about him before. I looked him up, and I saw that Andy actually was completely decimated by the press over the years. His career was disrupted. Everything bad that could possibly happen to a guy happened to this guy, except for, his stint with a supermodel. That was pretty cool. But I then said, well, if I'm going to stay true to my creed as a scientist, I'm actually going to read the studies. Now, I did not know that Katie Wright read the studies and saw that they were garbage. She did that before I did. I read those studies. In my previous job to being an author, I was the director of a research corps at the University of Pittsburgh. I had academic appointments in Department of Pathology, University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute, and I was used to doing study design. I was used to doing the systems biology that you just heard called for. I was used to doing complex science where we could ask complex questions. And I read the studies that were published by the CDC, and I said, oh my God, this is garbage. I could see it instantly that they were cheating. They would grab a data set, analyze it one time. They didn't like the result. They'd throw it away, that result. They'd change the study design. They looked at the result again and rinse and repeat until autism went away, until autoimmunity went away, until ADHD went away, whatever they wanted to make magically disappear. And that's when it struck me. As a nation, with as many vaccines as we give our children, including hepatitis B on day one, I realized we were flying blind in terms of our health. What are we doing to this generation of children? My two sons, born in 1999 and 2001. What is happening? Who knows what's happening? I ran into some guy named Brian Hooker when I was doing my research because he had something about an MMR study, and that was late. I said, listen, would you do an interview with me? And he graciously said yes. And at the end of the interview for that chapter, he said, we're making a documentary. And that was Vaxxed. So I listened to all of the transcripts. I read the transcripts with Bill Thompson and with Brian Hooker. And yeah, the fact that the MMR study was altered just as I just described these other ones, that was shocking enough. But the number one thing that everyone needs to know, especially the press, is that Dr. William Thompson from the CDC told this doctor, Brian Hooker, right here, that every single vaccine study that was published by the CDC or contracted by anyone working for the CDC was put through a sanitation process. Every last one of them. So now I knew we were not only flying blind, but we didn't even know what kind of aviation machine we're flying. We really have no idea about vaccines, and that's where we stand to this day. We really do not know the scope of the effects of vaccines on human health. I'm teaching a course right now, Vaccines and Immunity, and I'm still learning things from the reductionist view of looking at systems biology. And I've been at this since 2015 in earnest, and Gracie and I parked outside of a CVS. I realized if I included this particular chapter in this book, not only it would just tank the book, there goes my dream of being a best-selling author. By the way, it's available on Amazon.com. It's called Cures versus Profits. But not only that, but it would tank my academic career, that no major medical institution would ever hire me again. Gracie and I thought about it, prayed about it. It was the kids. You cannot understand how anyone, let alone a pediatrician who has sworn their life to helping children, can walk away from a child as if they're just a number on their spreadsheet. Everything that you heard in the last panel, I'm so glad they brought it up, but I want to reiterate. If I were to fall on the ground and start seizing right now, a seizure, the EMTs would come get me, and en route to the hospital, they'd stabilize me. There's a whole series of tests that they would run on me. They check my blood sugar, among other things. They would check my blood pressure to make sure I wasn't bleeding out internally. Parents are told while their child is screaming and then going into seizure after vaccine injury that, yeah, that happens sometimes. It's normal. Let it burn out. They'll be better in the morning. And time after time after time. They're not. Sometimes they don't wake up. And death from vaccine injury actually is a reproducible process. There is a clinical progression from death. I've heard it too many times from parents that told me, first they turn blue. What does the doctor say? Well, you don't have to bring them in until this or the other. You have a child that's blue. What does that tell you? Raise your hand if you know what it means to have a child that's blue. They're low in oxygen. Did you know that the aluminum that's in vaccines binds to a molecule called transferrin? Transferrin's job is to take the red blood cells, is to take the iron from the diet and put it into the bone marrow so your baby and your body can make red blood cells. And if you bind up that transferrin with aluminum, they're not making red blood cells. This is not just vaccine-injured children. This is biochemistry. This is happening to every child that receives an aluminum-containing vaccine. And yet, did you know that the FDA has to this day, has no pediatric dose limit for aluminum in vaccines? The only pediatric dose limit that exists is from my study, one of my studies, where I published and I looked at what they said was a safe level in adults, and I did very simple math based on body weight called Clark's rule. And our kids on first day of life are receiving 14 to 20 times the dose that any adult would ever receive. Now remember what I said about transferrin. There are other things we can go into in the mechanisms of vaccine injury. I have articles on those too. You can look those up. But the gall of the denialists is, well, they really need to learn their lesson. And I want to say I'm apolitical. And take my word on it, I am apolitical. I can't choose a party because I can't choose a party. I'm not going to get into why. But today, former President Barack Obama on Twitter wrote, we have people in power making broad claims around certain drugs and autism that have been continuously disproven. The degree to which those comments can undermine public health, do harm to women who are pregnant, create anxiety for parents and who do have children who are autistic, is violence against the truth. I wrote to him, that's reckless polemic. Please stop dividing. You do not know what you were talking about. I have the honor of working closely with Secretary Kennedy since about 2015 as well. I think it was Brian that introduced us. And, when just the very thought that we have the opportunity, knowing what the problems are for so long, it's 2025, I've known what the problems are for 10 years, I had to get involved. So there were parents that would come to me and say, you're a scientist, would you like to be a witness in my vaccine injury trial? And I said, sure. I'll do the research, I'll look at the science, and I'll say these are the mechanisms of how vaccines can cause harm. And I quit the program after one of the special masters tried to bribe me to change my testimony, and I refused the bribe. I withdrew all of my invoices, and I left the program in protest. And that issue has now been referred to the Attorney General's office. I have a recording of the attempted bribe. Please understand that those that would do weaponized language to divide people are not our friends. Not only do we need freedom of speech and objective science to be able to understand our world and teach our children what the world is and how it really works, we need mutual respect to be able to come at each other with integrity, with the anticipation that if we disagree and we actually work it out, one of us is going to learn something, and that's a good thing. But they don't want to know. They don't want to know. I want to weigh in just briefly on what the last panel talked about in terms of treatments for kids. That is absolutely a priority for parents. I happen to think that the number one priority ought to be the prediction of who's going to have a problem with a vaccine, so that you then change their clinical path and prevent it, which of course is taboo. And it's taboo not only because of the money, but because the power structures that are involved, people threatening to pull money from this organization or that. Pharma-funded AAP, that's their new name, by the way, did you know that? Pharma-funded, pharma-backed AAP, take your choice. They lie to each other about vaccine safety. They just have these conversations online and in their papers and everything. They actually lie to themselves. And so reformation of medical education should be a number one priority for the NIH. Absolutely. Not just on the treatment of autism, but what predictors exist. And I have a whole list of them. I've done this. I've looked at this for a long time. I have a whole list of them. I'm expert in AI. I'm expert in machine learning. And I'm telling you right now, there's not, whether we change the vaccine schedule or not, I'm really glad, Drew, that we are, that there's going to be a reformation there. And we've already seen ACIP in action. But I'm telling you right now, I think we know enough that we could get almost every single kid out of harm's way if they're destined to regress to autism, and if they're destined to develop autoimmunity, and if they're destined to develop ADHD and those kinds of things from vaccines. The proof is in the pudding, and so NIH should have a major research funding, just a program, one program, that they're going to study the effects of vaccines on human health, study the effects of aluminum on human health, with the specific intent of changing clinical practice to get kids out of harm's way. That has to happen, and it has to happen now. We owe it to our kids. We owe it to the next generation of kids, so that we have a cohort of kids who are actually a big red stop sign comes on the screen. The parents shouldn't have to figure this out. We are entrusting the pediatricians, we're entrusting HHS all these years. We've trusted the government to look after, at CDC, to look after our best interests. It should not be, the onus should not be on the parents to figure out vaccine risk on their own at high cost. It should be something that's done in earnest, specifically written in the press, that if NIH, Bobby has said it, if they do not reduce human pain and suffering and put a reduction in chronic illness, then he's not interested in doing his job anymore, because he's not the right guy for the job. That's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So I work every day on this. Bobby works on it every day on this. Everybody that you see here talking works on it one capacity or the other. There are so many things to change that are exactly wrong, that I want to encourage all of you to get as involved as you possibly can. If you're a scientist, join a study section at the NIH. If you're a medical doctor, join a study section at the NIH. Offer your services. Be vocal with the press. Make yourself available. If you're a mom, a dad, whatever you do in your life, educate other people, not to warn them against vaccines, but just to say the entire system's broken. Be part of the reformation. Go down to your congressman's office and say, we need new bills that change things to help Bobby. He's not a one-man band up there. He can't do it all on his own. And there's certain things that have to change to take legislation too. So, you know, with that, I'd like to introduce the panel and have them introduce themselves. You guys met Brian Hooker already, and you met Richard Frye. So we'll dispense with the biographies because in the interest of time. But Brian, why don't you talk a little bit about what you want to talk about, and I'll do a round of questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Jack. And thank you so much for your comments. It really does take everybody getting involved. And at the risk of sounding like, you know, a PBS fundraising pitch, I do want people to continue to hold these agencies' feet to the fire. We have to do it. Just because you see something happen, you know, in the rank and file in the NIH, the CDC, the FDA, CMS, wherever, doesn't necessarily mean that the Secretary of HHS knows about it. I mean, one of the things that I noticed, there was an NIH Autism Data Science call for proposals, and I looked at the awardees, and I realized there's something really wrong there, because it's just sort of the same people that have been doing the same thing, just more genetic reductionism, maybe some gene-environmental interactions, but it's the same people that have been funded for so many years that have really, you know, taken us down this 20-year road to nowhere. And so, you know, we do need to get involved. We need new scientists on the study sections that are reviewing these proposals, that are making the recommendations, that are scoring these proposals. Otherwise, we do get sort of Ricky and Lucy reruns. I mean, you know, everything, this has to change. And just because it happens doesn't mean that it's Secretary Kennedy's fault or NIH Director Bhattacharya's fault, but they need to know. And their feet need to be held to the fire. And if anybody would echo that particular message, I know that it would be RFK Jr. For that directly. I also really want to quick talk about acetaminophen.
I asked you the questions.
Okay, you are. Okay, we can just save those for the questions then? Yeah. Okay, very, very good. Okay, I just real quick, I want to thank these gentlemen that are with me on stage, and all the practitioners that don't necessarily have any quote-unquote skin in the game. I mean, they do. And one of the things that I know specifically about Jack is that he takes these children personally. He takes them on. You know, these men and women who are doing this aren't doing this to get rich. They're not doing this for their careers. They're not doing this for notoriety. Otherwise, then they've made really, really bad career choices. But they're doing it because they're like Jesus, and they're touched by the feeling of these children's infirmity. And that's what they're, you know, you talk about Jesus' arms extended to society. It is these practitioners who would dare ask the question where pediatricians and family practitioners are turning them away. So I couldn't have more respect and more thanks for them.
So Richard, you know a thing or two about research. We'll get to the question and answers about environment and genetics afterwards, but you know, just give an opener, if you would, about this particular topic for the panel and your role in it and what you know.
Yeah. Well, you know, the research on autism at the NIH has been very disappointing over the last number of years. You know, and one of the reasons, you know, I think is that, you know, there was a bill that was signed, I believe, by President Bush to, you know, to allocate so much money to autism research at the NIH. But from what I understand, the NIH wasn't given any money. So they just told everybody, all the institutes, well, you're all going to do autism research. So, and most of them said, well, that's not in our mission, you know, that for us to do that. You know, this isn't the home for autism. So nobody really is welcoming those grants all that much. The other issue is that, yeah, we were in the age of genetics at the turn of the century. That was the really big thing. We were going to sequence the genome, and we'd finally find every gene for every disease. And it didn't work out that way. But we trained all these geneticists, and we have all this equipment to look at genetics, and genetics is important. And so what happens is you have these scientists that are on the panels that review this work who are biased. That's what they do, so that's what they understand, and they don't appreciate other you know, points of view. You know, it's not what they're trained in. And so those type of alternative grants get you know, pushed to the side and not funded. And the fact is that the funding pay line now is very, very, very low. You know, I remember when I got started in research in the 80s, it was 25%. So, you know, 25% of grants, I mean, they had good grants, you know, got funded. And now I think it's down to 4%. So you not only have to have, what they say, advocates on there, on the panel, but you have to speak to exactly what those particular people on the panel want. And it becomes a you know, perpetuating system where new research does not get, you know, funded. The other thing I think that in general, one of the differences from the United States from other countries is that in other countries, a scientist is given a salary by their university, and they don't have to write grants for their salary. They have to write grants for their lab to support their people, their supplies. In the United States, an investigator has to include their own salary on the grant. And so that means if they want a good salary, one, they have to get lots of grants, which causes competition. Two, what's really unfortunate is that that grant, a lot of it's taken up by salaries. And they can't spend that money on technicians and other supplies. And so it makes a very competitive landscape. And of course, then there's the idea at universities that they get a lot of overhead, you know, and that's something that has been, you know, talked about. And, you know, many mainstream universities, regular universities may get 30%, but, you know, you have universities like Harvard which get 100%. So if I was at Harvard and I got a $2.5 million grant, which is your standard in our R01, the institute would get another $2.5 million just to pay for the lights and the room that I'm in. So the universities make it so that this becomes very competitive for these NIH grants because they want the money for this. And you know, really good research becomes underfunded. It used to be that many private foundations would fund, you know, some of this up-and-coming research, but as the budgets got tighter and tighter at NIH, then the people that usually get grants went to those foundations. Of course, then there's the issue with publishing papers too, because if you don't publish exactly what they want, they're not going to you know, appreciate that research, and then it gets published in a lower journal, and they say, oh, you see, it's not good because it's in a lower journal. So the way we do research, the way we appreciate research, the way it's funded is very flawed right now. One of the major things I feel is that there's many times not an appreciation of the impact of research. And so, you know, and this is what, you know, I said recently is, you know, there's these people that get $2.5 million for to study a gene that affects 3 people. You know, you could give me $30 and I can affect, you know, probably more than that, but you could give me several $1,000s, $10,000, and I can affect, you know, 2.5 million people just by, you know, spreading the word about leucovorin and doing that type of research. So I don't think we appreciate what the impact, and I don't think it's really focused towards treatment. We're always looking for the cause, and the cause is important, but as a doctor, you know, I'm a doctor, so I want to heal patients. So, you know, that's great if you find the cause, those biological mechanisms that are, you know, in the molecular parts of the cell, but I want to know what's going to help my patient. And if I can find something that helps my patient, you know, you can figure out all those other mechanisms later on. I want to get, you know, kids better.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. So I'll just start since there's, thank you both. I'll just start since there's no one that, you know, willing to ask me questions. That's fine. I'll just start with what I want to tell you guys. Looking at the genetics question, I want to teach you the history of genetics research and autism, where Katie Wright and her father had a division over this as a major issue. If autism is genetic, it's nobody's fault. It's just something that happens and nothing going to do with it. Your life is set. You're going to have to be that way. It's not preventable, so you can't treat it. It's genetic. And so they set apart with the whole genome studies to do genetic studies, and they would find genes that are associated with the risk of autism diagnosis. But they couldn't find any genes after finding about 600 of them that where any of the genes explained more than 1 or 2% of the genetic risk. And then they kept searching and searching until they got about 850 genes. And Autism Speaks, the organization that Katie separated from over ethics, they actually celebrated every single one of those new gene discoveries with a headline. And sure enough, mainstream media, hey, they found a gene for autism. Hey, they found a gene for autism. Hey, they found a gene for autism. After about 850, it became really evident, especially after I published my book, The Environmental and Genetic Cause of Autism, that they weren't explaining autism. If none of these genes explained autism in terms of inheritance liability. So a group of them put their heads together and said, I don't know, what we'll do is we'll actually pare down that list. There's too many. We'll pare down that list. And we'll get to the core set of genes that we think are most important. And of course, they went for the neurological genes. They didn't go for the detoxification deficiency genes. They didn't go for the methylation genes. They want to make it neurological, neurodevelopmental from a neurological, like neural impairment. And so they got this core set of genes and said, oh, scientists believe this. They got a headline. Scientists still think it's genetic, but these are the important ones we need to focus on. And the purpose of that was really just for pharma to go find drugs. It was twofold. We're going to go find drugs that could impact these and maybe have some effect. Fair enough. But then the strange thing happened. Next year, guess what they found? Hey, we found some more autism genes. Found some more autism genes. They wanted the headline. So they've kept funding new discovery research on autism genes, and that lasted about a year or two. And then it became really ridiculous to say that autism is genetic when the numbers really show, and our messaging was successful, especially Tony Bark, a friend of ours who's beloved and belated, that you can't have a genetic epidemic, right? It doesn't exist that way. So we've all said it, and the message, I think, stuck that the jig is up, if you will. And the heritability, Tony Lyons mentioned heritability, and that it seems like there's autism traits that are heritable. But that's only because traits are heritable. Think about the diagnosis of autism. What is it? You have repetitive behavior. You've got, whether you're very social, not social. These are heritable human traits. The fact that brain function is heritable is what they're really tapping into on the heritability of autism, right? So a lot of people know dads of kids with autism, and they might have, they kind of like to keep to themselves or whatever, but they actually lied in the last 3 major heritability studies, because in the first 3 or 4 heritability studies, they would say, let's look at how much of it's genetic with a correlation. And they calculated something called liability. Under the liability calculation, you're looking at 40% genetics. 40% genetics leaves 60% for environment. They couldn't have that. So they kept changing study designs and doing it in a different way until they got to the point where now they say, oh, it's between 80 and 90%, if you look at the headlines today in the mainstream media. But they never refer to the original studies, and that's not fair. They need to refer to the original studies and say that the range is here to here, and why did it increase? Why did the heritability increase over time, like clockwork? The studies that have never been done and that the NIH need to fund have to include genetics and environment in the same study with the same people. So not only can you understand the percentage that's due to genetics and the percentage that's due to environment, but you can calculate genetics times environment interaction. It's a very specific, easy to do study design. It doesn't take $3 million. It takes about $150,000 and a good electronic health record and some surveys. And then you put a p-value on the genes, and you put a p-value on environment, including common environmental exposures, and you put a p-value on the interaction term. If anybody knows a statistician, You can actually get them to agree with you that autism has not been studied. They'll know what an interaction term is. They'll say, you know what a good way to hide environment? Do genes over here and environment over here, but never do, or even do genes and environment in the same one, but don't look at the interaction term. You can bury the action in the interaction, because the interaction can be more important than one of the main effects. Now, I'm getting in the weeds on this for a specific reason. Anybody from this day forward who says autism is genetic doesn't know what they're talking about. There is zero chance that anybody knows what the size of that interaction term is, because it's never been done, and until it's done, nobody can say it's genetic or environment. You can say it's environment partially, you can say it's genetic, but you can't say either or. That's the nature of this ignorance, and it's enforced ignorance, and it has to stop. So another topic I just want to mention briefly is, okay, why doesn't everybody get autism? Right? It's the same vaccine schedule. No problem. Well, there are a couple of reasons. You can point to the fact that the nurses weren't shaking up the vials with the mercury in it, and some kids got larger doses. That's a risk. You can actually look at the fact that there's a cohort of kids that got aluminum and mercury-containing vaccines combined. But if you look up the paper, Autism is an acquired cellular detoxification deficiency syndrome. I actually tested the hypothesis that these kids are not able to detox as well as other kids, plain and simple. And we birthed them, we brought them into and are raising them in an increasingly toxic world. It's so bad that I think we would have had an autism epidemic eventually, finding the same families, the same genetic lineages of people who happen to not be able to detoxify as well as others, even if vaccines were never invented. Petroleum chemicals are absolutely poisoning our food, they're poisoning our water, they're poisoning our medicines, and it's the waste left over that they say, how do we agricultural, how do we do this? Let's make a kind of fertilizer out of this or something. Plastics, the things that you hear about all the time. I teach a course, environmental toxicology, because it's a huge concern. So not only do we have to have NIH then turn a sharp corner, do a 180 on genetics and environment for autism, we actually have to have real environmental science done. Major universities, they have endowed chairs. The endowed chairs include the chemistry department. Big Chem doesn't want anybody to know about environmental toxicology. You can't find a course on environmental toxicology like the one that I teach. 18 lectures that tell you the source and what to do about it, how to avoid it, how to shut it down. The source, the biological effects, and how to shut it down. So, and I taught that course because this was before I developed that course, because I didn't think we would ever get anywhere we are right now with Bobby Kennedy as secretary. I thought we would never get there. I'm like, okay, we're going to have to clean up all of the rest of the world because they're going to insist on vaccines for everybody forever if we're going to have any effect. That's how dedicated I am. It's online. You can go to ipac-edu.org and sign up for it. But so the way that vaccines contribute to autism is that aluminum or mercury goes into the brain. There's no doubt about that. Chris Exley showed that there's no doubt about the fact that aluminum makes it to the brain. But we've known it since 1985 when they found that amyloid, that thing that you hear about with Alzheimer's, is part aluminum. Amyloid in the brain is part aluminum. So if it gets to the brain and it kills cells, those cells die. Microglia pick up those dead cells to clean up the brain, the cellular debris. They become intoxicated with aluminum and they die. If you distract your microglia during neurodevelopment, you cannot have a proper neurodevelopment. They prune the brain at the right time, in the right way, to make the brain a human brain, the way that it is. I'm not saying people with autism are not human. Please don't quote me and twist that language around. I would never say that. They're beautiful human beings. The fact is, if you can't develop your brain right because you have chronic microglial activation, it becomes an unstoppable inevitability that eventually you're going to lose everything that you got over neural development when the doses are accumulating as the aluminum builds up to toxic levels in the brain. You're going to regress. That is known. That is not controversial. Kids have chronic microglia activation from the age of 5 to 25. It's in the literature on autopsies of kids who died from other causes with autism. This other thing about neurodiversity, the last thing that I'll say for my part of this is people say, let's celebrate autism, it's neurodiversity, there's just differences and differences are okay. What's the average lifespan of a kid with an autism diagnosis? Does anybody know? 34 in the United States. Is that okay? Is it okay that we're celebrating neurodiversity instead of saying, what? Okay, so we really need to get the aluminum out of kids' brains. We need detoxification, chelation studies, not the type of chelation that you hear about, bleach and all that garbage. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about mild, long, slow chelation, because it's chronic exposure to toxins in the environment, including mercury, including aluminum. And if you can get that out, I have a protocol. I reversed my asthma. NIH needs to study slow, prolonged chelation to reverse asthma, autoimmunity, ADHD, and autism. That has to happen now. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya should be putting a research program together. Bobby Kennedy tells me they're going to study the health effects of aluminum on humans, so that's good news. So the really good news is we can do something right now. So let's go to Richard, if you don't mind, first. Richard, what exposures do you see parents reporting that attribute to the initial causes of autism?
So, we, as you know, we do a lot of research on mitochondria.
Yeah.
And so some of the studies, we developed an assay that is to look at not only mitochondrial function, but mitochondrial resilience. What we found is a signature to neurodevelopmental regression, that for some reason these kiddos, their mitochondria is actually functioning about twice that of normal. It's like a little race car, but as soon as it hits a bump, it falls apart. But the other thing that we were, in our research to kind of look at these things is we found out that that environmental exposures in utero are highly correlated with these changes in the mitochondria. So we've done a few studies, one at looking at air pollution, PM2.5, and we found that prenatal air pollution exposure has just looking at mitochondrial function of a kid that's 8-10 years old, has a significant raw correlation without correcting for anything of this. We also collaborated some of the work by the Mount Sinai School of Medicine with the baby teeth, where we showed they had showed that manganese and zinc levels, low levels prenatally, you could distinguish twins, which was going to get autism.
Yeah.
Well, we showed those in the regressive type autism, those change mitochondrial function long term.
So those who don't know, mitochondria are the parts of the cell that power the cell. You can't do much if you don't have an engine in your cell powering the processes of the cell. And
the brain, it uses up 20% of the energy, but it's 2% of the weight of your body. So it uses a lot of energy, and when it develops, when it changes, it needs a lot of energy to change. Not only after you're born, but before you're born, there's lots and lots of energy. And the mitochondria, this powerhouse, works in all different parts of the brain. And we know that if it's dysfunctional, actually even prenatally, if it's experienced prenatally, the brain will not develop as it should. If it's too slow, we know that the neurons don't develop enough. If it's too fast, they develop too much and there's overgrowth. And that's what we see in autism. So, one of the major things that I think we see is that, the most, the environment that is that's most influential is that 9 months in your mom's belly. And we don't pay enough of time to that.
Yeah.
Okay?
Let me ask you, is maternal immune activation during those periods of time a risk factor?
Yes. And so if you, and this is some of the things I've never understood about people that, promote vaccines. Like, if you're going to make a vaccine for a tiny little baby, why would you put mercury in it? I mean, maybe it's bad, maybe it isn't, but why would you do that? It sounds like a really bad idea, just from the start.
Yeah, it is. It is. And then imagine trying to develop a brain, this magnificent, highly complex, trillions of cells thing where pruning programs have to happen at the same time. And you have a mitochondrial dysfunction that's genetic or environmentally induced, perhaps, and the brain is repeatedly anoxic before or after birth. Like I just said, you don't have transferrin making red blood cells. Right? The aluminum goes in the bone instead. So the people that are aluminum apologists, they say, don't worry about it. It all goes to the bone. How did it get there? The FDA published that it actually binds to transferrin. So do you think that mitochondrial dysfunction could be responsible in part for detoxification deficiency?
Oh, most definitely. So what we see, if you look at the handout we have, we talk about there's this trifecta of oxidative stress, glutathione deficiency, mitochondrial dysfunction, neuroinflammation. And these, you can start in many different areas, and it creates a vicious cycle, which then perpetuates itself and makes you more vulnerable to environmental toxins. These are all systems that are influenced by the environment. Anything, not even toxins, inflammation, nutritional deficiencies. So when your systems, and we know this about kids with autism, is that the detoxification systems are running 200-300% of normal. So they need higher than normal levels of certain nutrients. Yep. So normal nutrients is just not enough for them.
And oxygen.
And oxygen.
So yeah. Richard, last question, if you don't mind. If we had total information from mother's medical record, child's medical record, and a survey on environmental exposures at home and at work for the parents, what percentage of autism do you think is preventable?
So this is great. I'm really glad because I didn't get to this point. So what we're finding is that all these metabolic problems and neuroinflammatory issues that we see in kids with autism, we see in the moms, okay? And so we're finding that that there is heritability, but it's not genetic. These metabolic and immune abnormalities are heritable, you know, and you can just think about that. If your mom has some type of mitochondrial dysfunction, their metabolism isn't working, not making the same energy, then the baby's cells are going to adapt to that. They're not going to grow normally, and they're actually going to change the way their mitochondria work because they're not getting those fuels, or maybe they're getting certain types of metabolic intermediates that interfere with the way that they work. So what we're finding is that these things are actually transgenerational, heritable, can be found in the parents, both mom and dad, some of these things, and you can detect them before time, and then if you can intervene preconception, before we even start to have babies, then we could change the rise in autism to and reverse the course. So
yeah.
It's better.
So do you think it would be like 50%, 70%, 80%, 90% could be prevented if we stopped putting toxins on purpose into children?
Well, I think there's many different things. I think you know, definitely the toxic load is important. Giving the right nutrients. You know, making sure we feed our microbiome correctly. That's something we haven't talked about, which is transgenerational too. Yeah. You know, so I think that this whole idea of just becoming healthy, you know, and treating our bodies correctly by decreasing the toxins and putting the fuels and the good nutrients it needs could go a long way to reversing a lot of chronic disease.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let's move on to Dr. Brian Hooker. Big hand for Dr. Richard Frye, please. Could you discuss, please, the role of acetaminophen in autism causation?
Well, when you look at how acetaminophen is detoxified, it is primarily detoxified in neonates and postnatally through glutathione-regulated pathways, or basically methylation and sulfation. And so if that is not properly detoxified, then a toxic metabolite called NAPQI then can accumulate in the brain. NAPQI is a neurotoxin. We know that autism is a neurotoxic condition. If you look at there's a paper called by D'Estasio that came out in 2019 that shows frank damage of microglia. It was a phenomenon called microglia blebbing, where the cells actually pinch off these small blebs or exosomes that are essentially damaged cells. So that is caused directly by NAPQI. Now, when you hear all this, you know, when I first started learning about Tylenol, I was like, oh great, one more thing to think about, you know, one more toxin. But it is, I believe, in many cases of the etiology of autism, it is necessary, but is not sufficient. You still need the genetic terrain, and then you still need the oxidative stress along with acetaminophen for autism causation.
Is there a window of susceptibility for acetaminophen?
Absolutely. The window of susceptibility is really postnatal. What I would call perinatal during labor and delivery, especially after cord clamping, because then you cut off the mom's bloodstream. And then postnatally at that particular point in time, then the risk regarding acetaminophen does decrease postnatally as the newborn gets older and older. But I still believe that there's a risk, and there's a risk of regressive autism up through 5 years of age.
Yeah, I remember the advice of doctors saying if you're going to go in for your vaccine, give your kid acetaminophen beforehand, right, in anticipation of a fever. So I asked Richard about the maternal immune activation during pregnancy, and the idea in the mainstream medical thinking is we don't want infections during pregnancy. That's why we want to do vaccines. But not every woman gets influenza during those 9 months. Not every woman gets COVID-19 during those months, and not every woman gets tetanus or pertussis during those 9 months, but every woman that vaccinates 3 times gets all of those antigens as well, right?
Yeah, and I mean, the thing is, it's that you can plan for this, right? If you're going to get pregnant, you can make sure all your vaccines are up to date, you know, if you want to do that, you know, and so you don't have to get vaccinated during pregnancy. You know, other things like, you know, influenza, where it may be a seasonal thing. You know, one thing you could do is have people around the mother get vaccinated so she's not exposed to that, so they don't bring that home. So there's other different ways that you can prevent those disorders and even get the vaccines that you need without doing it during pregnancy.
Thank you. So, Brian, back to acetaminophen. It's been around since the 1880s. How do you explain this dramatic rise of autism starting in the late 1980s?
The rise in autism, again, it is sort of a fire triangle of acetaminophen, oxidative stress. Best way to get oxidative stress is to directly inject the toxins into your body vis-a-vis vaccines, and the genetic landscape on top of that. But starting in the 1980s, there's a baby aspirin scare with Rye syndrome. Okay, and so baby aspirin was no longer recommended during pregnancy or, essentially for postnatally. And that's when the advent of baby Tylenol started to come about. Then on top of that, you start to increase the oxidative stress. With oxidative stress, you also increase the need for some type of pain reliever, fever reducer, and so acetaminophen use then skyrocketed along with the vaccination schedule.
Thank you. So, sounds like you're moving away from pointing a finger at vaccines and autism. Is that true?
Wow, bite your tongue, dude. No, absolutely not. No, there are, taking a delivery system that gives you 100% absorption of a toxin is not good for you. It is just plain not good for you. You cannot, the vaccines do not get a pass in this. Mercury, aluminum, formaldehyde, polysorbate 80, triple live viruses, even a single live virus at the concentration that we don't, by the way, Merck does not tell us how much virus they put in the MMR vaccine. We know the minimums, we don't know the maximums. So again, it's such a great tongue-in-cheek delivery system for these toxins. They do not get a pass.
Thank you very much. So a couple of closing points. Dr. Brian Hooger, ladies and gentlemen. couple of closing points that I want to point out. You mentioned triple antigen sources. Under the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, if you're going to sell or distribute a vaccine in the United States, the only part of the vaccine that has to be tested by law for safety is the proteinaceous part, and they don't even do that. Those safety studies would be animal studies where they increase the amount of antigen to animals and see what happens when you finally reach that overload point. What's the LD50 of the MMR? It's not published. What's the LD50? That's the number of animals that die after vaccination. Well, you know, 50%, that's the dose at which 50% die. But we have to change the Code of Federal Regulations so that dose escalation studies on every ingredient in vaccines has to be studied the way that it is in drugs. There's fillers in drugs, in pills. You go to the pharmacist, you get a pill. There are things that cause latent release, slow release of drugs. They have to be tested, right? We have to take the environmental toxicology of vaccines seriously in the phase of development, bringing them to market. And that's something we can do with a signature. We can have a signing statement by President Trump or Robert F. Kennedy Jr. changing. I think he can change the Code of Federal Regulations that way. I want to leave you guys with a story. It was before COVID. I think it was about 2018. Gracie and I like to travel, and we're foodies, so we stopped at this restaurant. And I went up to the bar to get a little, I don't know, Clue and cream for Grace or something. And I sat next to this guy and struck up a conversation. What do you do? Oh, I'm a retired pediatrician. Really? Oh, okay. What do you do? I'm an author. What's one of your books? Maybe you look familiar. Oh, the environmental and genetic causes of autism. He said, you use the word cause. Are they allowing you to do that now? True story. That's part of the problem. Let's stop restricting speech. Let's speak in plain English language. Patients and parents and doctors need to be able to share and compare ideas without getting at each other's throats. Be respectful, be kind, and provide a world of a rational society in which we are here to learn with and from each other, and stop this nonsense. Thank you all much for being here.